Hi, Natalie. Are we already filming, Natalie?
Yes, I'm looking for that right now. Shoot. Yeah. Nope, that's not it.
So you need to mute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think some ODE staff are still being let into the room, and a few other folks will be joining us soon.
Hello, everyone. I just arrived. Cindy, it looks like we could be ready to start.
Yeah, I was giving folks a chance to, I think everyone from the waiting room is in. And it looks like we have many of our advisory group members in. So Tamara is our slide manager today again. So there we go.
Great.
Oh, yeah, I think we're ready to start. Thanks, Colt.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. It's been just a few days since last time we were here. Really appreciate that you came back and are ready to help continue this work with us. I was just at Foundations for a Better Oregon, where they were talking about this work as I entered the meeting and as I exited. So this is really clearly important work for folks across the state of Oregon. And we have quite a bit of it to get through today. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and just give you a little bit of a preview of what's coming. Again, because we're in this virtual space with each other and it's challenging to create community in this space, we're asking you that during the meeting, keep your camera on, and of course, step out whenever you need to. You know, restroom breaks, all those water in, water out ideas, as our colleague Dr. Garcia would say, are always welcome. And if you have bandwidth challenges, then of course, you know, go off camera and listen in and join as best you can. Do be aware of your background and surroundings. We always at the department welcome children and pets, so we're not talking about that kind of thing. But if you're in a distracting space, then you go ahead and turn your camera off during that time, and try to stay muted when you're not speaking, so we can hear the speaker at that moment. Okay, Tamara. So this is what our ambitious schedule for today. So we'll do this welcome. I'll get through this in just a minute. And then Carmen's going to take us the next step, revisit the group agreements that we discussed last time, put a proposal forward to you to see if we can land those today. And we may move forward if we get stuck in that space, because we have a lot of information to share. We want to put it in front of you, a summary of the feedback that we got from the last meeting. We want to talk about who it is we are serving in the state of Oregon. Our students that are 40% students of color, our educators, our teachers are about 11% teachers of color, and a lot of other information. So we want to make sure you know who it is we're talking about when we're talking about the work on this particular study. We're going to go through what our school level expenditure reporting looks like. This will give you some information about what can feed into the work that the researcher will do. And then we'll talk some more about that contract and get some of your input for what it is we're asking the researcher to do besides what's clearly laid out in the budget note. And then we'll close and have a few next steps. Next slide, please. You can go ahead and put that all up. So this is, again, the budget note. So we just want to always keep this in front of us. I think there's one more section that has the report time on it. Again, that the legislature, through one of our budget bills that impacts the department and the school districts, attached this budget note that is asking us to look at specific patterns that result in disparities between students who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color and those who are not BIPOC. So that's the key to what it is that we are working through. Part of it allows us to bring this group together to take a look at that research and get your input, and to take a look at some specific studies across the number of school districts. And this will again be work that the department does and that this researcher does, and we'll be bringing back to you and getting your thinking on that. The budget note asks for the results and findings of the study and the advisory committee. It doesn't ask us for recommendations. Again, like Cindy said, we may want to offer those, and the legislature may want to accept that part, but they definitely want what the results of the report and the findings of the report. Next slide. Oh. And then I think I'm passing it to Carmen Ciamara.
Yes, thank you, Cole. Buenas tardes, everyone. So deep levels of appreciation for the work that we all did at our previous meeting around the proposed group agreements. What we're going to be reviewing today in small groups is basically, the agreements that we already looked at our last meeting. What you're also going to be seeing that some of the agreements stayed the same, but some of the agreements were enhanced. And I want to highlight in this particular slide, like lead positionality behind. There was really rich conversation around what does that mean? What does it look like, sound like, and feel like? And so we're going to go deeper today in our smaller groups and be able to talk about that. And did we actually capture the intent of the conversation that you all had? I'm not going to read these slides because Ben is going to be adding a handout that has all of these proposed group agreements that we're going to be reviewing in our small groups. Next slide. So again, as you can see, We have experienced discomfort, commitment to building our trust. And the last one that I just want to highlight, all data and information requests will be made through advisory committees, facilitators, and not directly to ODE staff. And results of the request will be shared with the entire committee. These were the agreements in these 2 slides that we reviewed in our small groups. Next slide. The next slide highlights some of the new agreements that you had conversations. And again, there's 2 things that we want you to be able to focus on today. One is, are these agreements still resonate for you to be able to lean in and participate in the conversations that we're going to have? One. Second is that some of the agreements were shifted and enhanced. Does that meet and honor the conversation that you had in your small groups? And these are new agreements for you to be able to consider, which is starting fresh, focus on BIPOC and tribal students, and get caught up. And I want to highlight that what that means. If a member misses a meeting of the advisory committee, the member will take personal responsibility to read all materials from the previous meeting and or reach out to ODE facilitators as needed to catch up. Within your, next slide, within your groups, one of the, you're going to be again with the same facilitators, and we're going to be asking these questions. And as you can see on your left side, there's a little camera. If you want to take a picture with your cell phone so you can have these key essential questions that we're going to be answering, that's fine. If you don't, we're going to be, your facilitators absolutely are going to have those questions. The questions we're going to be asking in our small groups are, what questions do you have about these agreements? What else do we need? Do these agreements enable your full participation? And also, facilitators are going to be holding the space for kind of a fist of 5 protocol. Next slide. The fist of 5 protocol that's going to be happening in your small groups is kind of a sense-making protocol, which basically, if you have a fist, that means, or a 0, it's that, you have no opinion or you were absent in the previous conversation. If there's a 1, that means that you strongly disagree and must be accompanied by a proposal. If you have a 2, that means that you disagree and have reservations. And also, if you have another proposal that we would consider. If you have a 3, that means you feel neutral and I can live with it. I'm like, okay, let's move forward. I can live with this. If you have a 4, is you agree and support, and you have a 5, that is an enthusiastic, let's move forward. I agree with these proposed agreements, and period. So we're going to be having that that conversation also within our small groups. For the facilitators, when we come out, is if you can come and be prepared to highlight and summarize the conversation so we can all have a taste of what the conversation that each group had. And if you can give us also kind of a range, we're going to be taking the temperature, and we're going to be asking you again to vote 0 to 5 in the chat so we can sense make. If you have a 1 or a 2, what's going to happen is that at a later point, we're going to be reaching out to you and engaging you in a conversation so we can understand deeply why is it a 1 or a 2. And we're doing this because we want to honor what, again, what you have to share, 1. And unfortunately, we don't have time and space in this particular meeting. I'm being very transparent to be able to engage in that conversation. And we want to bring it, forward at our next meeting. So if there's no questions, I would say let's move in. Yes, Cindy?
Carmen, this is Cindy. I see that Marguerite has her hand up.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry, Marguerite, because I couldn't see it because I have my full screen. And your question?
So my question was around 2 of the agreements, leaving positionality, and then if you have to miss a meeting, getting caught up. Again, as an educator, I am missing supporting my schools today. I was not able to give input on today's meeting. I feel like the positionality of those that were allowed to have input on scheduling the meeting forces me to have to get caught up on future meetings. So I don't see in today's agenda where we're going to be talking about the scheduling of future meetings and how we are going to this was part of the discussion from last time, honoring those of us that are having to miss work or miss something in order to be present at these meetings. And I think if you want to have in classroom teachers to be on this committee, you have to consider that we work 8 to 4.
Absolutely. And in your small groups, and I know that you brought it up in the previous meeting, let's really highlight that. And then we can come up with a solution. And I'm gonna, give that particular piece to Cindy. How do we facilitate? So we are honoring, absolutely, it's access, right, to the conversation, and access that you don't have to leave your children behind to be able to fully and authentically participate in this space. Note taken. Thank you.
Carmen, this is Cindy. On our last slide, we mentioned a doodle poll moving forward, for members, because we know that folks have various, both personal and professional commitments at various times of the day. So we wanted to give folks an opportunity to contribute to a poll evenly.
Beautiful. Thank
And
you.
then that would be used to determine times of other meetings.
Okay, so in the magic of Zoom, I'm gonna do 30 seconds. Any other questions? And again, your facilitators can answer those questions if you have further questions around the agreements for purposes of time. And thank you for your patience and your grace with this process. Again, facilitators, when we come back, if we can summarize kind of the nuggets and the and the energy of the conversation that you had, and some highlights. And also we're going to be doing a temperature check with Fist to 5, but also please do that also in your breakout group. So thank you and welcome to the folks that were not able to make it at our last meeting. One of the things before actually we moved that we missed, if you can please write in the chat your name and who you're representing, so we know who's in the room, because we are going to do reintroductions in our room, but we don't have time to do introductions in the big room. So if you can write your name and your agency. Okay. Deep appreciation. Welcome, Carlos.
Hola,
¿Cómo estás?
muy bien, gracias.
Paul, welcome. Kali, welcome. Okay, folks, so magic of Zoom. Cindy, we can go to our small group conversations.
Hi, Cully. He, did you get moved out of your group?
Issue is I joined on my phone, but now I'm joining on my computer because I was in transit. So I'm trying to get on now.
Okay.
So I'm on twice. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Do you need help getting in, or Natalie can move you in if that's helpful?
I think
Hey, Carmen.
Can you please put Callie in to the room?
Yeah, that's what I was doing. That's why I didn't answer. So
Okay.
she should be there now. Okay. It didn't work.
I need to get to room 2. I was just put in a different one.
Okay. Natalie, did you hear that?
Yes, so you need to be in room 2. So
Yeah, that's where I started.
yeah, let's see what I can do here. Move 2.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, my bad. There, I think that did it.
Thank you.
Were we supposed to do a doodle poll in our group, or is that something that's coming later?
Doodle poll for the upcoming meetings will be something that is sent to you. And then
Okay.
yeah, so you're good on that. And I'm just checking in.
I was going to say, how did we finish so early?
I don't know. You guys are just so quick. You just know what you want. And they also have a few more people in some of those groups, depending on, the attendance. The other group is done. They just haven't come back. And then the other groups are ready. I think they're coming back. Yeah. I think there may be one that's still maybe discussing a few things.
So there was a little confusion. So thanks, Carlos, for flagging the issue. If you're watching live on YouTube, what's happening right now is we've got some groups who are in their breakout rooms and other groups are coming back to the main room. So we will all reconvene in the main room here in just a couple minutes. And you should be able to hear all the conversation from that point forward.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for the conversation. I know our conversation was amazing, and I am going to call out group number one. What are some of the things that were elevated in your group that you would like to share?
I think that was me, group one. We had a great conversation. I think there's broad agreement with the agreements as they've been described. There's a couple points where we wanted to clarify, have a little more discussion. The positionality agreement, I know that's been a topic in several other small groups as well, but that was something we clarified, that we're not asking people to release their position in their district. And like, you can bring the lens of a superintendent to this conversation. You can bring the lens of a teacher, but that we're really trying to let go of rank is what we're going after with that agreement. So we talked about that a little bit. I know there were some other proposed changes in other groups that we were trying to communicate to our group. And I think there might be need some more further discussion if we make edits to some of those. But in general, as they're described now, we had, I think everyone was a 3 or higher, or 4 or higher in my group.
So I am group 2, and we were all 5s. And some of the comments that I want to be able to elevate and reflect back is that deep appreciation for specifically around the new agreements that focus on BIPOC and tribal students, and how do we continue having the initial focus is our BIPOC and tribal students. The next focus is not an or, it's an and when we're focusing on maybe a rural communities or special education. So be really clear and not create a false dichotomy of what that means. And always remember what that looks like, sounds like, and feels like that of our initial focus. Also, the use of BIPOC and tribal students. Is there another word that we can actually center what that means, and that our communities are not monolithic, they're extremely diverse, and how do we hold space for that conversation so it is extremely clear? And if this is a data informed conversation, how is it that we reflect the charge of that committee? And gentle suggestion around, is there another word or terminology or explanation that we can clarify this BIPOC and tribal, and then clarity that this is not a monolithic, we're not monolithic communities, we're extremely diverse communities between the categories of the community, and how do we bring that forth? And I'm looking to our group 2. Is there anything else around the big nuggets that I'm missing? Those were the 2 mains, and everybody was a 5, but yes, with some slight revisions if we can make them. So thank you. Group 3.
Yes, I had the pleasure of working with group 3, and we did 2 votes. The first vote was as is without their suggested changes, and then the second vote was with their suggested changes. So the first vote, we had 2, a 3 with reservation, and a 3. And then the second vote, we had all 4s. And so here are their suggested changes. On positionality, please add access to meetings as a component of positionality. Again, about, if we schedule it during the day, that really does affect those that are not in the position of being able to leave their workplace. The second thing about positionality is that if people are saying, I represent a certain group and therefore I have to go back to my board before I can have a specific input or a decision in this group, then there was concern about whether that would delay the findings of this group or just not work well for the group in order to come to consensus. So they were concerned about that notion of positionality. The second point that they made was that on the starting fresh concept, it seemed like we were maybe talking around something, and that maybe we should be more direct. If we're saying that we're not going to talk about adequacy of funding in this group, then we should simply state that. And the last one was on focus on BIPOC and tribal students. They didn't feel the word focus was strong enough, and they would prefer the word center.
Beautiful.
And did I capture that correctly, group 3? Was there anything else to add?
Great. Our final group?
Yeah, so that was my group, group 4. And my group was okay with the different additions to the group agreements, with one exception. So they focused their conversation on the starting fresh provision, and they're particularly concerned with the second sentence that says, we agree to let go of any baggage from previous conversations and not to rehash old arguments, because they felt that this could limit their ability to bring up historical knowledge, to bring up experiences or experience level. Many, if not all of my group have years of experience around the state school fund, and they didn't want to be limited by that. They did have, and when we voted, they were all 2s. They did have a proposal, which was with the starting fresh to only do the first sentence of it, acknowledging that these conversations have happened for many years, and that this is a new conversation and a new opportunity. Okay. And I would also open it up to my group if I missed anything.
Okay, waiting time here. Anything from group 4 that they want to add? Okay. So we are going to go back, but I do want to specifically, because we have 2s, we have 4s and 5s and a few 3s, in the different groups, specifically around starting fresh. and there was a recommendation that was made. Can you repeat that, Cindy?
Yeah, the recommendation, they had a couple, but this was the simplest of the recommendations where they landed, which was to keep the first sentence and eliminate the second sentence.
Okay. And so the first sentence would be, while we acknowledge that conversation around the state fund have happened for many years, the advisory committee is a new conversation and a new opportunity. So just for this particular one, because there was kind of a disparity around that, I would love to do kind of a fist of 5 if we approve or we agree or we can move forward with that change. So if you can please add your fist of 5, fist 0, you can, it's fine. You don't care. 5, you completely agree. 3, you can live with it. Questions? Yes, Lori. Okay. So if any comments on that? Toya?
So thank you. Would love to hear a little bit more, maybe from a representative from the group, because as I read this, and I guess I'm someone sort of in the middle of the experience here of having been here for a little while, but not as long as others. Just really wanting to understand the consternation around letting go of baggage, because some of us have had these conversations with each other for years, and wanting, I intend to start fresh from these conversations and move forward, but just wanted to understand a little bit more from folks in the group what letting go of that second sentence means.
I can jump in if you want me to here, Carmen.
Okay. Great.
For me, this was the issue. I think the term baggage has some negative connotation with it. And what may be baggage to somebody could be somebody else's truism. And I think this is a fresh conversation too, given the budget note and the group of students that we're talking about. And I'm committed to having that fresh conversation as well. And maybe I'm the old guy in the room. I've been around since the state school fund formula was created, was part of those discussions. And that is baggage I'm going to bring to the room. But I see it as more of history rather than baggage. So I'm committed to a fresh conversation around what the budget note brings forward, Toya. But I've been around a long time. I was there when this thing was created. So
that's helpful, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah.
Amanda?
Yeah, can I just make a suggestion? Because I think that, the first sentence to me is sort of an acknowledgement that this has been an ongoing conversation. And I feel like the second one, I totally understand. I think it could be reworded. I think that's probably correct. I think part of it, though, is the commitment to how we show up to this conversation. So maybe there's a rewording that is more about not just, we acknowledge that this has been an ongoing conversation, but we actually commit to the new, a new conversation and sort of this fresh opportunity. So don't have the language for that, but I do think the action, that commitment makes sense in an agreement. So it isn't just, I acknowledge that this has been going on.
Yeah, we if I could, Carmen, sorry, we did have that conversation and Morgan threw out some language besides just eliminating that second one. And maybe Morgan has that, but we had 2 proposals. One, eliminate the second sentence, and one come up with kind of what you talked about, Amanda, because Morgan was in our group as well. So hate to put you on the spot there, Morgan, but.
Okay, 1 second, Morgan. Ben, can you please write this down, Morgan?
Sure. I can't remember exactly what I said, but essentially, I think it's along the lines of what Amanda was saying, rewriting the second sentence to make it more positive. That is, acknowledging that this issue has been political. It's been, we've had challenging conversations in the past, but we should assume good intent from everyone and along the lines of a fresh start type language. And I apologize, I didn't write it down when I said it, but okay. that was, Cindy might have captured it, but it was just more assuming good intent, acknowledging that these have been challenging conversations in the past, but we all assume good intent and are ready to move forward.
So what I'm hearing, because we can start wordsmithing, so I want to put a proposal so we can move forward, is that we as the ODE staff, we're going to go back, we listen to your input, and we're going to reframe that particular agreement to say, this is how we're showing up. This is our commitment, and kind of make it more center, present, and future. Did I hear that? And I think within what Amanda said, Jim said, and also Morgan, we can come up with some really great language that where everybody will feel that they can actually wrap themselves around this particular agreement. So if we make that revision, then I would love to do a fist of 5 around all of the agreements that we're proposing, if we're okay with that. Understanding that we're going to bring this particular agreement with some shift in language. Does that make sense? So just calibrating, and this is just sense making. This is just taking a temperature around where we're at, fist of 5 around the agreements, with understanding that we're going to bring different language for that particular agreement at our next meeting. So if you can add it to the chat, that would be beautiful. I'm seeing a lot of 4s, 5s. So 3s, thank you, thank you. Okay. So I think we have everyone. And if you are still a 2, you know, and you still have some tension around it, please message me, and then we will meet with you and have a conversation. So at this point in time, I think what we're proposing is to move forward with these agreements, to try them out, understanding that we're open to other agreements as we continue our conversation. So with that, much gratitude. Thank you for this exercise and how we're going to be holding space for each other as we move forward in the conversation. So then I am going to then have Ben, I think you're next.
Yep. Thank you, Carmen. And Tamara is going to get our slides back up. All right. Well, thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts on group agreements. And now we'll get back to the work of the committee in terms of the feedback from last session. So what Tamara and I did prior to this meeting was we went through the notes that each of the facilitators took in their small group meetings. And there's a bunch of notes, a lot of good detail that was represented there. And so what we tried to do was bring forward the 6 top themes that we heard across the different rooms. So this is what we came up with as an ODE team that we'll walk through together. And then at the end, I'll open the space up. If there's another key theme that you think isn't reflected here in one of these 6 categories, you'll have the opportunity to bring that forward for the full group. So the first one is a clarification of the charge of this advisory committee. Is this work focused just on spending at the district and school level, or is it about allocation of resources? How do we define the terms impacts and spending pattern as they're described in the first sentence of that budget note? So on this one, Cindy is actually going to address this right after we finish this summary. So we'll come back to that one. Then the second theme was about school level spending. How do we actually determine how dollars are being spent at the school level and whether that spending is effective? There was also some discussion about equity lenses and whether locally adopted district equity lenses are impacting spending patterns at the school level. And then there were several questions about the state school fund formula based on Mike Wiltfong's presentation last time. So how does the funding formula impact different variables? And then how do those variables impact the funding formula? BIPOC and tribal students, teacher experience factor, teacher diversity, rural schools, SPED population. We had different questions about all of these variables represented in the small groups discussions. And then there was some questions about the history of the state school funding formula. To Jim's point, how and why was the funding formula created? What was its original purpose? And then there were some questions about, does the Constitution allow for weights or specific funding based on the race of the student? And then the final 3 themes, in nearly all the groups, there was some discussion of another model or program or initiative in education. So what could be learned from or incorporated from other policies and initiatives? The Student Success Act, Student Investment Account came up, House Bill 3499, for those of you who don't know, it's the English Learner School and District Improvement Program. And then the EAC, the Educator Advancement Council, all came up as examples of other models where there've been some level of success. There are some process questions. How will the researcher be selected? How will the researcher's scope be determined? And then, of course, what role does this committee and the members of this committee have in the process of selecting a researcher or determining the scope? And then finally, there was several folks who brought forward gratitude for the small group component, so that we actually had an opportunity for folks to be in a space that was more safe to share their feelings, and to be in community with one another as we're processing some complex information. So those were the 6 themes that we picked out. But we know there's a lot of other things said. So with that, I'll just open it up for a few minutes to see, is there anything that wasn't captured in these summaries that you think would be important to elevate for the full group's consideration as a summary from discussions that you heard last time? And feel free to just unmute. I can't see hands because of the way that my screen is, but if you can just unmute and speak if you have something to share.
So Ben, this is Jim Green from OSBA. Looking at the screen that's up now, the process, I'm assuming you guys at ODE will be able to answer those questions that are in that one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, we're not just going to leave them hanging. We'll answer them at some point.
Yes, fair. Some of these questions, I think we will, I don't want to say leave hanging, but they won't be answered quickly or perhaps even in today's meeting. They'll be, throughout our meetings together. But some of the process ones, like the first one, we'll be able to answer today and get clarity on. The rest we might have to work.
Yeah, no, I get that. It was specific on that one for me.
Mm-hmm. In fact, Colt or Cindy, do you want to speak to the researcher process? It was mentioned a little bit last time, but maybe another clarification.
Ben, we have researcher slides later in the presentation.
That's right.
That are going to address. Yeah. I like a little suspense.
Keep on the edge of their seats. Okay. Well, this isn't the end of the conversation, obviously. And as things come up, you can share those in the small group. And the facilitators of the small groups are meeting frequently in between meetings to prepare. So you can always bring something up there if you don't feel comfortable bringing it up in the full group. But with that, I'll do a last pause for folks to weigh in here. And then I'll hand it over to Cindy.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. So next slide. And this is one you're going to maybe get tired of, but I want to at different times today kind of ground ourselves back into the budget note. And so that's not why we're kind of flashing the slide up. But what I'm going to take us through a little bit is a couple of those questions that came up about the clarification of the charge. So as we were looking at this and as we were thinking about that research contract, we're going to be talking in more depth later in today. One of the questions that came up in the small groups is, what is really the charge? What were some of the assumptions, and why were we created, or why was the budget note created? There was questions like that when we reviewed the small group discussions. So next slide. And so what our core ODE team did is we looked at the budget note and thought about the language in there and crafted this, what is the underlying problem the budget note is trying to address, right? Because as you start to look at policy changes and shifts in laws and shifts in how we do things, it's always nice to go like, what are we trying to fix, right? And so we drafted what's there in front of you. And so this seemed to be the underlying assumption or the underlying problem. Monies distributed by the state school fund are not being consistently expended equitably on BIPOC and tribal students at the state and local level. This spending pattern has contributed to both achievement and opportunity gaps between BIPOC and tribal students and their white peers. State level laws and local policies are creating or influencing this result. So now I want to start to unpack this. So the first statement around this, the budget note very specifically is mentioning the state school fund. It's not mentioning like the SSA or some other funding sources, right? It's very specifically centering and focusing on BIPOC students. We talked about why we're including the language tribal students and everything. It's also focusing on both state and local level. It's not just on state, not just on local. And then it talks about, it does not use the words achievement or opportunity gaps, but it does talk about impact, right? And so how do we measure impact? And it also, seems to have an underlying assumption that the spending pattern is contributing to these particular impacts. And then again, that these state level laws and local policies are creating or influencing this result, right? So now, so I think I want to throw it open to the group, about if you have any comments either on this problem statement, or this issue statement, kind of underlying assumption, or anything to add as you were looking at the budget note, where there seems to be an underlying assumption. Okay, and Amanda, I see your hand up. And you're muted.
Just going to have a conversation with myself here in my office. So I think that's really helpful to start to unpack and think about what might be driving the question, because I think that's definitely going to inform how we move forward. I do also just want to name also how important it is to lean into sort of the plain meaning of that particular charge and that point. I don't want us to move off track because we're trying to figure out what the problem statement was here, but to think about, I actually thought there was a lot of intentionality around the term spending pattern, for example. And in my mind, when I first read this budget note, which I honestly personally was not involved in, thought it tied more to issues around transparency and less on the outcomes. So there's, how do we measure the impacts? I think that's a really important question that needs to be included. I'm glad you named it here. The other piece is, what are the spending patterns currently, right? And how do we build more transparency or understand what those are for current spending that's happening? So less on jumping towards the outcomes and just understanding what's happening currently.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, the word spending pattern, I think it more than implies that it's not just a one-time thing, right? For a pattern, it has to be multiple times, right? So anyway, yeah, thank you. Morgan, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Morgan Allen at COSO. So I would second the things that Amanda just said, but the one thing when I saw this sort of clarification of charge is these are sort of put out as statements. I think they should be put out as questions. Are monies distributed by the state school fund, being consistently expended equitably at the state and local level? Are spending patterns contributing to both achievement and opportunity? They feel more like questions to me rather than statements that we are trying to answer. That's just my perspective. These feel like, we're either disproving or proving these statements. I feel like they're more open-ended questions.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting, as I was looking at this, I was like, okay, there's definitely some underlying assumptions, but are these questions? And, and when we go into the researcher charge and some of the questions we're going to be asking the researcher, you'll see some of those slides phrased in terms of questions, right? But I think sometimes it's good to think about what are the underlying assumptions going on here, with this. The other thing that I should have mentioned, just for clarification, is that anytime ODE gets, a bill to implement, or in this case, it's a budget note, we take a look obviously at the plain language, we take a look at legislative intent, we, may listen to committee hearings, the floor sessions, where the legislators spoke on it, testimony, all of that kind of stuff, right? To determine what's the intent of it and how are we going to implement it, right? So with this one, though, it's not a law, it's a budget note. So it didn't go through sort of that normal committee process where we would have testimony and statements on the floor. So there's not really a strong legislative history to fall back on. And so that's why I also thought it was really important, and also based on the small group discussions, to really start to talk about and unpack this is okay, what is the problem statement? What is the questions that we're charged with answering, right? So Scott.
Hi, so kind of to get to it, since the charge is to study, and in our clarification of charge here, you're making these statements like Morgan said, but shouldn't we somewhere say, if they're not questions, couldn't we say that these are the assumptions? You know, this doesn't say anything about assumptions. This is like, these are given facts. And I don't think that's what we're trying to prove, right? I mean, that, you know, we don't know that these are given facts. These are what we think might be going on. But until we have the data and stuff, we can't really say that this is. So I guess, you know, that it doesn't say assumptions, or, you know, these are the things that we're looking to unpack.
Thanks, Scott. And let me see, I think I was just told that Toya has her hands up.
I think that Scott helped clarify what I was about to say. It's sort of a combination of all that's been said. There isn't a weight for students in the funding formula based on these characteristics, right? And then we learned that the weights don't necessarily follow the kids directly. So we don't really, I wouldn't even say it's an assumption that monies are distributed, because we just don't know quite yet. And that's part of the conversation in the study. But yes, there's a lack of complete transparency down to the student. And then we just don't know what the spending pattern will look like quite yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and many of you may recall at the last meeting, I talked about some of the challenges we have relating to data, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about that researcher contract. We definitely have some challenges relating to data and some limitations. And you'll start to hear John and Mike today, as they're going through some of the data, talk about some of those challenges as well. And I think
Marguerite has her hand up too.
Yeah. And Marguerite, sorry, I cannot see everybody's hands. So Marguerite, please.
Thank you. In the statement, it talks about state level laws and local policies that are creating or influencing. I'm wondering about local policies. Being total novice in this area, what local policies could be creating or influencing a result, or how folks are spending the money, how it's impacting the state. Because I'm thinking we're studying state funding, therefore it's state level laws, and that would be it, not necessarily local policies, because we're not studying local policies and local spending habits.
Yeah, Marguerite, thanks for that comment. Where, you know, when I was looking at this, it talks about studying like 25 school districts and disparities and differences between those districts and how they're distributing money, right? So that's what I was looking at in relation to like local level versus state level. It seemed to be talking about both. And yeah, so, but also, you know, the legislature doesn't adopt local policies. They may direct them, but they don't adopt them, right? And we are making recommendations back to the legislature. So yeah, so this tension, if you will, between local or state level laws and how much they influence this versus local policies and actions. I know one of the groups brought up things like around, like, for example, the adoption of an equity lens by a district. Does that influence this? And that's definitely, it's not exactly a local level policy, or it could be, but it's a local level action. Are there any other hands up? I want to make sure that I've not missed anybody or anyone else who wants to raise a question or comment on this. And you can do so in the chat as well, either way. Okay, so thank you. So I'm going to be bringing you back to this when we talk about that researcher contract. But before that, we have a couple of great presentations on data. But Tamara, can you take us to slide 15? Okay, but we'd like to give you a 5-minute break before we dive into data so that you can stretch and, you know, get some water. So thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Why is it a 5-minute break seems to go by so fast? Okay. So for our next presentation, we're welcoming an additional staff member from the Department of Education. His name is John Weeds. He's our Director of Accountability and Research. And he's going to walk us through some of the both the student demographics and some teacher information as well. So Tamara, can you advance to the next slide? And John, take it away.
Hey, hi, good afternoon, everyone. As Cindy said, I'm going to show you some data here. What we're going to talk about is really race and ethnicity and how it's reported for students and for teachers. This is actually a pretty complex topic, and I'm sure you'll have many questions about this, and we could probably go down many rabbit holes here and talk about this for quite a while. So I'm hoping to give a good overview and then allow you to ask some questions of how this works. So this first slide gives you this pretty long history, last 20 or so years of teacher and student diversity in the state. And so the yellow line is students who are ethnically diverse. These would be non-white students. And you can see that that's grown pretty consistently over time. And we're now close to 40% of students are reported as non-white. Teachers, we also have, there's another line there that includes also students who might have English as a second language. Those students that are emerging bilinguals are added, and that's a little bit higher. We also have in the green line the history of non-white teachers in the state. And you can see that while that has been growing, it's been growing pretty slowly. And clearly one of the goals of the agency is to help diversify, and the Educator Advancement Council is to help diversify the teacher workforce. So we have a diversifying state and a slowly diversifying teacher workforce. All right, this data here is all about how we are federally required to report race and ethnicity for our students and for our teachers. So I want to go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about how we do that. The regulations for how to report race and ethnicity to the U.S. Department of Education changed in around 2009, 2010 to this new two-part question. So when districts collect race and ethnicity data on their students and on their teachers, they're required to ask a two-part question. And families and students and teachers have to answer both of these. First is, are you Hispanic/Latino? And I know I'm using the federal words here. So are you Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, yes or no? Okay. And then there's a second question that has to be asked and answered, which requires students and staff to select one or more races. And there's 5 options: American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black African American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and white. Again, I'm using the federal terms, just to emphasize this is federally how this is described to us. So you answer both of those questions now for the last 10 years or so. So how do we take these? It's really 6 pieces of data. How do we take these and report? We have six what you might call flags. We have yes, no for Hispanic, Latino, and then we have yes, no for each of the 5 races. Okay. So how are we required to report this federally? Well, students who are Hispanic are reported as Hispanic regardless of race. It's the Hispanic trumps all rule. And that actually causes some data quality issues for us, as I'll describe later. So if you answer Y to the first question, when we report to the federal government, you are Hispanic. If you select no for Hispanic, Then we look at the 5 racial categories you've chosen. If you've chosen more than one of those, you're reported as multiracial. If you choose only one of those, then you will be reported as one of those races. Okay. Now, districts and states can actually collect finer information on race, so long as the categories that they have can be rolled up into the 5 listed above. So essentially you can subdivide each of those categories into finer distinctions if you like. So Asian could be divided into a number of categories. But again, if you offer more racial options for your students or teachers, they have to be rolled up into one of these 5. Okay.
So John, before you move to the
Yes.
next slide, we had a question in the chat, which I think you kind of answered, but I just want to make sure. So the question was, do Hispanic kids not count in race?
They don't. In the way that we report to the federal government, yes, the race is hidden in our reporting for the federal purposes. The student is Hispanic regardless of race. So yes, if you're Hispanic, you aren't counted in any one of the 5 racial categories. Again, this is federal reporting. It must be noted that these standards are for reporting data to the federal government. The state could choose to report things differently. As of now, we tend to report according to federal guidelines, but for our own purposes, we could report differently. So we could do things differently for our own purposes. Okay. Another question about multiracial, yes. If you are not Hispanic and you select more than one race, then you're reported as multiracial. So if you say no to Hispanic, but you identify as Asian and Black, you would count as multiracial in the federal reported categories that we report.
Would a student be allowed to be Hispanic and Indigenous?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. The answer is yes, obviously, for the student. But in the way that we are required to report data federally, if someone marks Hispanic and American Indian Alaska Native, they're reported as Hispanic. But there are some special programs where those rules may differ a little bit. Tribal consultation rules actually look at the race flags separately. Okay. So a student could identify as Hispanic and Indigenous. But again, for federal reporting, we would report that student as Hispanic when we report data to the federal government.
But
So the next
ultimately, that
slide,
means you don't keep track of the information of the racial identity of Hispanic kids when we're going to be unpacking this data.
I missed a little bit of your question, but I think the answer is yes, we do know the racial identities of Hispanic students.
Okay. So you can unpack that.
Correct.
Okay.
We can actually unpack that even given given our sort of crude collection of this right now. Let's move to the next slide, because this gives you an idea of the difference between how students might be identifying and families might be identifying themselves versus how we report students. And again, there's flexibility at the state level for our own reporting for us to do something different. Here is a table that shows counts of students. This is based on October 1 enrollment. Counts of students that we report to the federal government versus how they might self-identify. I'm not sure I said that quite right, but let's look at the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander column there. You can see on the column that says federal, this is the count of students that we report to the federal government as Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. However, if you look at the count of all the students in the state who had marked yes for that flag, it's 2.5 times as big, almost 3 times as large. Those other students, that 7 or so thousand other students, are being reported as multiracial or Hispanic. Okay? And so a lot of the kids who have identified at least as Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander and possibly something else are not being federally reported. Similarly with Black African American, the number of students who identify as non-Hispanic and select only Black as their race was 13,000 last year. But if you look at all the students who identified as Black and something else, possibly Hispanic or white or something else, it's over 30,000 kids. And so again, that's over double the number that we report. And if I can be a little bold here, the way American society works, a lot of those kids that mark Y as a Black flag, I think society would consider as Black. Yet our reporting undercounts them. So I think, you know, we can say that the way we're federally required to report, I think, hides a lot of what we know about our students. These are actual student counts, not weighted by the state school fund. Okay. Some of these, again, I could probably talk for hours, but I will try not to. There's an additional complication with Hispanic that I need to make you aware of. The Hispanic trumps all has caused some inconsistent reporting for Indigenous and white race flags. You can tell from enrollment forms and just counts of students at various districts that Indigenous students from Central and South America, for instance, are not consistently reported across the state. Some of those students are being reported as American Indian Alaska Native. And in some districts, those students are being reported as white. You can see in the data that there's not consistency there. So the Indigenous and white counts, you have to treat with a bit of caution because I don't think the data is being consistently reported. Well, I don't know all the reasons. There's a question about why is there no consistency. This is a bit of speculation on my part, but just looking at the data, a few years ago, there was a new requirement for tribal consultation. If the number of students reported as American Indian Alaska Native was over a certain percentage. I don't know if April or Ramona's here. I think it was 50% for the race flags. And that required tribal consultation. And I saw after that rule came out that some districts switched how they reported a lot of their Indigenous students from American Indian Alaska Native to white. There's another issue really that the American Indian Alaska Native category, I think, is hard to, it's just a difficult one. The very definition that the federal government has is problematic. And I know there's some hands up, some questions, I'll get to them in a second. The American Indian Alaska Native says a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America and who maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. This is actually from federal guidance. But I think there's also some areas of the federal government that would like this flag to represent recognized tribes in the US. And I'm not sure that there's clarity among districts about which of those it should be. So I think some districts might report kids as American and Indian Alaska Native more narrowly, thinking of recognized tribes in the US. versus the broader definition for Indigenous people of North and South America. And this sort of distinction has been hidden because of the Hispanic trumps all. Most of the kids that are where this is a question, should they be Native American or white as they're reported, it kind of goes away because they're Hispanic. And I know there's a bunch of questions. There's some hands up. Let's start with the hands up. I think Amanda has a question.
Sorry, I'm going to take myself off mute. I think it's tied to Marguerite's question, and maybe something that we put a pin in, but that is absolutely relevant to this conversation in the future as we move forward. Just understanding, like I understand some of the issues that the federal reporting requirements are bringing up, but I'm still, I guess, not quite clear about at the state level what barriers we have for folks consistently reporting to ODE and to the state across Oregon. What are some barriers to having more consistent reporting there? Because it seems to me a problem that folks can pick and choose at the local level in that way when we're talking about how we're counting certain student populations. So I think in the future would just be like to understand this process a little bit better. What kind of training and guides and requirements are included, even if it's just one conversation or separate information that we can review.
Yeah, well, this is really a failure on our part, I think, to provide clear guidance. But I think even at the federal government, there's not clarity about what some of these racial groups mean. But ODE could absolutely provide clear guidance about what. So again, the American Indian Alaska Native, that I think is the most, for me, the one that has the most issues with reporting consistently. There's no reason we should not get together and come up with better guidance on that to make it more consistent.
Yeah, and to put a finer point on that, I think, for example, and where I would like to focus on either the state policy or local decisions, and this gets to the impacts, is even the example you just gave of we have a state policy that requires tribal consultation, and somehow folks can make decisions locally to not have to meet that requirement just based on different reporting. Like that obviously is circumventing the intent of that policy. And so I just want to understand where the whole process, the pathway, so that we can see where things are falling through the cracks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there have been a number of questions. I'm trying to go back here. George had a question about data from this fall. We don't yet have that. We're still collecting it right now. So we don't yet have data from this fall. That won't be final until January, early February. There's still a couple districts who have not submitted to us yet, so I can't give you numbers from this fall. Questions, are there no guides? Well, again, here's where I can say that my team's not being active enough, or the agency is, my team's not being active enough in trying to train people on this. We do have manuals that describe what the ethnic and racial categories mean. And some of that, a lot of that language is taken straight from that guide that I just posted in the chat. If you open that and go to page 31 of what I just linked there, you'll see the definitions that we provide to districts. But you're right, there are some issues where I think we could provide greater clarity on for districts. Okay. Well, let's move to the next slide. The next slide is very similar to the one before. It happens to show percentages. It tells the same story, but it gives you an idea of the percentage of students that we report in various categories and percentage of students that have that particular one of those 6 flags marked as a Y. So we've lingered long on the previous slide, so I won't linger too long on this one. But I think the slide decks can be made available so you can see the percentages. There. But it just emphasizes that our current reporting is not reflective of the true diversity of our state. So next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit also about educators. I think there's some interest in the diversity of educators by this group. Here's a fairly simple graphic that shows 5 years of comparing students of color to teachers of color. It's similar to the graphic I showed above, but it just concentrates on the last 5 years and it's a little simpler. And you can see that indeed we are slowly increasing the percentage of non-white teachers. So I think this year, the next year is up to 10.9, I think. But it's not keeping pace with student diversity. The next slide, I think, shows some bar graphs, just again to compare directly student and teacher diversity. This is from 2019, 2020. So the teacher data is actually pre-pandemic, as is the student data. So this is kind of the last data before the pandemic. We had big shifts in enrollment during the pandemic. So I think it's probably appropriate to look at this comparison. And again, you can see the disparities there. One thing though that I'd like to point out is on the next slide, and that is, a lot of our teachers have been around 10, 20 years. In fact, I think the majority of our teachers are in their 50s. So if you look at teacher diversity, when you look at all teachers, that's this second column in this little chart here, you can see almost 90% of teachers are still white if you look at all teachers in the state. But if you look at teachers with fewer than 5 years of experience, so this could be teachers, pretty much straight out of college, or it could be someone entering the teacher profession later in life, fewer than 5 years of experience as a licensed teacher, you do see greater diversity. It's still nothing close to the student diversity, but for newer teachers, about 17% of them are not white. Again, according to the federal categories. So I think districts are making some progress for sure compared to where we used to be in working to hire a more diverse workforce. These numbers are significantly different from 10 years ago. So there is some progress being made in hiring a more diverse workforce. But as I've said, obviously, it's still not anywhere close to the students' diversity. And just as a comparison, that last column was looking at sort of long-term teachers who've been teaching more than 15 years. And you can see how different their diversity is. Yeah. So some questions in the chat. I didn't put the individual, well, there it is. Yes, you can, sorry. If you look at the Hispanic row, you can see there's quite a bit of progress there, if you like. There's 2.5 times as many newer Hispanic Latino teachers than Latinx teachers than there have been for the older teaching cohort. There's another question about, is there tracking of where they're coming from, where they go when they leave Oregon, and why they're no longer in the teaching profession or not teaching in Oregon? That's a really good question. My team doesn't have that data. I think that's something maybe we can work with Educator Advancement Council and TSPC maybe to get some answers. Yeah. So EAC is Educator Advancement Council. I'm sorry, I don't have access to that data, but we can talk to the EAC. there's also, I think, I know I should probably wrap up here, but I think there's some untapped data available in the statewide longitudinal data system where we can track kids from K-12 to higher education to the workforce. And the SLDS has been looking at some reports looking at what you might call attrition for various student groups as they move through the system. And if I remember right, the last time SLDS showed me, if you look at Black African American versus white students starting in 9th grade, there's a disparity in graduation rates in high school. That's been closing, but it's still significant. But by the time you get to graduating from college, my memory is it's like twice as high a percentage of whites graduate from four-year college than blacks. The disparity just grows. So there's attrition all along the way and then into teacher preparation programs that I think it's making it harder to diversify that workforce. Yeah. Okay, I think I talked for half an hour. I think that was my time limit.
Well, John, thank you. Fascinating as always. I did want to open it up if anyone had any last questions for you before we move to our next data presentation. Okay. Oh, Morgan has a question.
Thanks. I just had a real question, kind of tangentially, but any theories or ideas why in the pandemic, it looks like the vast majority of students who left the system or are not enrolling are white students? Are they going to private schools? Are we seeing an exodus to private schools or homeschooling? Is there any initial data on that?
Probably, well, Morgan, not as much as you'd want. We did look at homeschool registrations at ESDs, but all we have are raw counts. We did see a huge jump in homeschool registration last year. It wasn't that the jump in homeschool registration wasn't enough to account for the 22,000 student drop last year. So, yeah, we don't have complete data, but you're right that if you look at the students if you look at the decline in enrollment numbers, whites were more likely, I think, than any other group to not enroll last year due to the pandemic.
Okay.
Sandy, I don't know if you can see that my hand is up.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Marguerite. Thanks.
So based on this information around race and ethnicity of the educator, there are many studies that show that students perform better and are likely to complete their programs if they have not only a teacher of culture, but a Black teacher. I'm wondering, because the question that we are trying to answer is the impact of funding, what kind of resources are put towards attracting, retaining, recruiting educators of culture, in particular BIPOC teachers, as we're talking about Black and Indigenous teachers. I don't know if you have a way of tracking that within your system. You're saying that EAC has some information on where they're coming from, where they're going, why they're no longer teaching in Oregon. I want to know what resources are being put towards educators of culture so that we can answer the question.
Yeah.
No. Thank you, Marguerite. Oh, go ahead, John.
A few years ago, my team did do a little study to look at, over the span of 3 years, how often did a student of color see a teacher of color? And that data is a few years old. I can see if I can find it in the chat. And it was not very often, right? So it kind of highlighted this idea that so many kids do not see anything but a white teacher, even over multiple years.
can you also see if where educators with different backgrounds are teaching? I mean, are African American educators teaching in predominantly African American schools, or you know, I don't know. I'm just wondering if that's look-atable.
Yes, it is. We know which schools teachers are assigned to. And so we can look at compare school and demographics to teachers. That's something we can do. Well, you can get me talking forever, but I will stop talking now.
Marguerite, I see your hand is up, but is that from before or a new hand?
From before.
Okay. 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 Thank you, John. Really fascinating information. Oh, Carlos, did you have a comment?
Just a shout out to John. Just thank you for your presentation, and I'm actually quite impressed and overjoyed just to see the 9.6% of Hispanic Latinx student growth within the teachers, you know, with less than 5 years of experience. And it makes sense because this, you know, this has been my passion for now, you know, almost 10 years. And a comment that Morgan, you know, wrote in the chat, which is really spot on, that at the rate that we're going right now, right, it will take us 30 years. But I think that, I mean, if you look at this column right here, the second column, 9.6%, that growth of almost 4% within just the last 5 to 6 years. I'm just thrilled to see this. So thank you so much. I had not seen this table before.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting. And we'll be sending these slides around to you. So as you're looking at them in more depth, you can ask additional questions to us and so forth. So, because yeah, there's just a lot of information here in these slides. So Tamara, can you take us to the next slide? So we're going to transition over to Mike Wiltfong again, but this time Mike is going to talk to you about, so kind of switching to that local level, that school level expenditures. So remember when we were talking about the budget note, there seems to also be a focus on what's going on at the school level, not just at the state level. So we thought it was important to put in front of you some of what's available at the local level regarding data right now. So Mike, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Cindy. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everybody. So a little background, and again, with everybody's understanding about this work, and this is a relatively new tool. You can see there where I put that this was actually a 2017 federal mandate. The familiarity with this isn't probably as universal as, but again, this is a tool that we have that we didn't necessarily have in previous conversations. So I think, again, this will be helpful moving forward. But with this presentation, I want to give a little bit of the history as to where this came from, why it was created, and then perhaps some of the limitations of this data and what we can and can't derive from it. So back in 2017, under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESSA, there was a requirement that this one sentence, it's a long sentence, one sentence of guidance came out in early 2017 that identifies that we're supposed to be reporting the per pupil expenditures of federal, state, and local funds, which is essentially all the funds, including actual personnel expenditures and actual non-personnel expenditures of federal, state, and local funds. And again, in my mind, that's pretty much everything. Disaggregated by source of funds. So again, that would be identifying whether it's federal, state, or local. And then for each local education agency and each school in the state for the preceding fiscal year. This is a substantial change in reporting culture where, for the most part, for many, many years, we have reported data at the district level. And so, again, many of the states struggled with this requirement because they didn't have the school level data in their system. Oregon was fortunate where we were one of just a handful of districts where we actually had built into our reporting structure operational unit or school level data information. And so this ability to move towards this, we didn't have to necessarily redo a lot of our systems in order to make this accommodation. So again, we were better positioned early on. But so going about this work seemed pretty straightforward. The per pupil expenditures, and what does that mean? What would that what would that look like? And so we waited. I would have to admit, I joined a number of my colleagues around the country. We kept waiting for additional information to come out from our federal partners as to what that report would look like. What data elements would we include in that? Because when we're talking about all funds, where you have debt service, you have capital expenses, and of course, from a comparison sake, that's not very good, because those can change considerably from year to year, and that additional guidance never came. And so states were left to implement this with essentially just this one sentence of guidance. And so some early presentations look something like next slide. Look something like this, where it showed the per pupil spending within a district. And so what we have over here on the left-hand side is the dollar amounts, and these are sorted. These are district high schools, and they're sorted from free and reduced lunch poverty data from a low to a high rate. But you can see that there's quite a bit of disparity between each of these high schools. And so again, essentially it's answering the question of that sentence, but it's not really giving us much information. And a number of us were saying, well, we need to do more than this. And essentially what we wanted to do with this data, the requirement was that we had to include this data, eventually included in our report card. But again, there are a number of us around the country that there was much more that we could do with this. And I'll get into that here in just a bit. But again, this doesn't provide a lot of information for the disparities. And I'll get into why those disparities exist here in just a moment. But again, I just kind of want you to think about this level of information, what we have, and that, again, we took this and moved it along considerably. Let's go on to the next slide. So you see those disparities from each of the school, and there's a lot of reasons why we have those variations from one school to next. And two of the biggest factors that play into that, of course, is the size of school and the needs of the school. So even here in Oregon, this is very true, where we have some school districts and some schools with just 2 students in there, and sometimes just 1 at times. But as you can appreciate, in order to provide the education in an in-person setting, you have the you have the teacher, you have the facility, you have the heat, you have all the pieces that go into that. So we'll just say, for easy math, $200,000. And so if you have 2 students, that's roughly about $100,000 per student in order to provide that education experiment. And so again, the where I'm going with this is that's why you see some of these variations. And I'll show some data here in just a bit where we see that across the state. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Needs of the school also plays into the factor that in some instances, some schools will have programs like special education programs or more regional programs. But again, those programs will have a lot more cost because of the population, the needs of the students within those programs within the school. And so you'll see that the dollar amount that's attributed to those schools is considerably higher than some of their counterparts within that same school district. As some of you identified earlier, is the strategies for allocating resources amongst the schools. Are there rules around that, or are there guidelines around that? And I will tell you, in this work that I've been, again, going back to 2017, when we started building early models and working with our partners and what that would look like and doing analysis on that, it was interesting to me to learn the different strategies that schools employed with allocating resources to schools, and as well as just learning around the country what some of those, what those allocation models look like, from where they use square footage in some instances, the numbers of FTE, and then, of course, the needs of the students, the numbers of students were oftentimes the factor in there. But again, there wasn't a consistent means with which those allocations had to be or should be or were being allocated to schools. Especially, as identified earlier, specialized programs that house at certain schools will also have some influence on there. And then also how school districts report their data. Schools, there's costs that are attributed to the school, and there's costs that are more centralized. For example, administration, facilities, maintenance, transportation. It's hard to break that down and attribute that to a school per se. And so those are reported at the district level. And so sometimes, depending on how a school district has set up their books and their accounting, some of those costs won't always transfer to the school. And so again, from district to district in the state, we will see those differences where for example, they'll attribute a lot of the expenses at the district level and very little at the school level. And so if you look at it, you'll see where there could be like $500 per student spent on the student, but clearly that's not the amount of money that they're spending on the student. And again, it's just how they're accounting for that. In this time, as identified a little bit earlier, there's been a tremendous change in culture where reporting the data we had to report to not only the state, but also to our federal partners was at the district level. And I will tell you that the migration of school districts reporting at the school is much better than where we started in 2017. At that time, we were looking at the 2015-16 expenditure data. And again, just to understand that there's a little bit of a lag from the time that the districts are spending the data that we're able to collect the data and report, and then you review that data. For example, the school level expenditure report for 1920 actually was just released in June of 21 earlier this year. And so again, that's just because the timing from where the data happens as to the time that we're able to collect it. So again, we have a little bit of a delay in that. So just to keep that in perspective moving forward, because I suspect there'll be the question, do we have more current data than 1920? And the answer is at this time, no, we won't have data for 2021 until June of 22. But getting back to this, the point around the school districts, I just want to really drive this point home, is that we have come a long way with how we are reporting at the school level, but clearly there's still some work in that as these reports become. And some have asked me, well, isn't there a mandate that you can put forward to that districts do this? And I believe that local decisions, local pressures will drive those conversations. And when we were building these reports, how we designed it, and again, our federal partners brought together some think tanks and national reportings and universities as to what a report would look like or should look like. And they came away from that with inconsistent guidance. In fact, they decided not to issue any guidance around that because of the inconsistencies of what that meant. When in my work with stakeholders and internal staff, and a very talented research analyst, Lorraine Nakamura, and I that were working on this report, we wanted to develop a report that was meaningful for a parent, a principal, a superintendent, a legislator, you name it. Somebody could look at this report and be able to glean information from it. And that's the challenge that I've seen in some other states, is that yes, they're doing this, but oftentimes it's buried in so much other data that it's hard to discern what we're really trying to get at with this per pupil data. And so that's part of the reason we built this into an Excel spreadsheet so that from an accessibility perspective, even the seeing impairs. I mean, how we built this report is so that everyone can access information and have information to it. And I'll show you just a little what it looks like here in just a bit. But I want to keep that perspective in mind, is that we built it in Excel so that you could bring up multiple versions so that you could do comparisons. And in the report itself, it lists all of our schools across the state. But if you have, and again, based on all the varieties of ways that we can display data, we thought this was the best. And again, so far we've had a lot of positive support. We've reviewed this with our legislature. We've reviewed this with our state board. We've reviewed it with stakeholders extensively. Again, many conversations were taken with this, putting this report together. And then again, as far as the discrepancies in the funding, additional resources will play a role in those differences. And it's, again, this isn't just taking into account the state school fund. As an example, I have there is local option and private donations. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see where this is a table that shows some of the school districts with local options in place. We have roughly about 20 to 21 school districts on average that have local options. This isn't the full list, but this is the size of list that I could share, that you could see discern information from it. So starting there at the top, we have Portland Public, which has one of the largest local options in the state. And with roughly 48,500 students, the local option per ADMR, or the average daily membership of a student, is about $2,500. And so you can see how, if you look at that in comparison to the other school districts, it ranges from $2,500 to $8,000 to $1,000 per ADM that these school districts have in additional resources. And again, the local option harkens back to Measure 5, Measure 47, and Measure 50, where districts can tap the gap between the assessed value and the real value when it was frozen many years ago, and then they can tap into that, pass a local bond, local option bond, and then they can use those resources, and that doesn't flow into the state school fund. And so again, that's also very important point. Also identified private donations, and again, on the state as a whole, that actually, it adds up to quite a bit of money overall. But the local option is probably one of the biggest additional resources at school districts, and also has shows some discrepancies amongst schools in non-school in comparison to other school districts. So I'm going to go to this next slide where it shows some of these examples of where we have high schools or schools and some of the difference that we see. So example there, we have Lake Oswego High School. They have a little over almost $16,000 is what they spend on a per ADM hour or per pupil spending. Whereas Salem Kaiser, you can see it's about $13,000 on average for their high schools. And so again, the almost $3,000 difference between that is a big portion of that is just, again, because of the local option that Lake Oswego has, which is roughly about $1,500, on the previous slide. And as we go down that list, you can see that if we look at Troy Elementary School, again, roughly $93,000. An example I used a little bit earlier, Troy typically is a very small school district in rural Oregon, and it typically has anywhere between 1 to 3 students on average. And again, in order to provide the education, it's a little bit more expensive. We also, a feature of the state school fund is we have the small school correction, and I'll show you a slide here in just a bit, but that small school correction will increase the dollar amount on a per ADM basis. And again, this is, we provide additional resources for these small rural schools because their ADM alone is not enough to drive enough resources in order to pay for facilities, boilers, maintenance, administration, teachers, what have you. So all that plays into those additional costs. And also I want to note that in the report, once you're in there, you'll see where we have students reported at the district level. And this is a phenomenon that within our data collections that we permit. There's reasons why districts do that. They have programs that are at the district level. And so we looked at everywhere that there was ADM in the state, whether that was at the district level or attributed to a school. And then we looked at what resources they were putting towards that. And so oftentimes you'll see the school district ADM is a much lower dollar amount. But I would like to believe that the school district is actually spending more on those students than just that, the amount that's identified in the report. And that's, again, getting to the challenge of how school districts, do their accounting, how they report for that, whether it's shifted to the district or whether it's at the school level, and also how their ADM is reported, whether that's at the district level or at the school. And so all these play a role in these differences across the state. So let's, I'm kind of looking here at the comments in the chat. So I'll get to those in just a bit. So let's take a look at the reporting tool here. This next slide. So again, I didn't want to chance technology and try to jump out to the actual tool itself and try to give a live presentation. But when you're out there, there you can see where I have the link. And so if you look at that link, it actually gives the breadcrumbs to where the site is located. So if you look at that, it says ODE, and then we'll have another site or another tab that's linked that says schools and districts. Then there's grants and pages, and then the K-12 school funding information. It will be the site that this particular report is located. And it will say in their school level expenditure report, and you'll see that we have 2018-19 and 2019-20 data available. So probably the starting off to give a little bit of a tour on how this tool works is in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see there's a drop-down list, and that will have every school in the state, high school, middle school, elementary school, what have you. And you're able to, if you just put your cursor in that, you can actually use your up-down arrows to scale through that. And you can see how all the charts move as you scroll through the schools. And again, what you can do is you can bring up multiple versions of this so that you can do comparisons of school districts and what have you. We haven't quite got it to where you can do the real-time comparisons and for example, we had that with Chalkboard where you could bring up and do comparisons with other schools. We haven't done that. We haven't been able to do that just yet. So that's part of our strategy moving forward, that perhaps we can improve upon this model. So, but again, another feature of this is that on the left-hand side, we're trying to satisfy our federal requirements where we're identifying the source, the fund source. So you can see that there's the whether it's general fund or special revenue, and these are the fund types. I will note that for Oregon, we decided not to include debt service and capital expenses, which is the 300 and the 400 funds. Out of the 7 funds that we have, we didn't include those because, again, we were trying for comparison, consistency's sake. We thought that we would have disparities between year over year, as well as just comparing district amongst district, because of some school districts will have bond activity and what have you that will inflate their numbers. And so we wanted to, again, for consistency's sake, just look at the 5 categories that would be the more traditional categories. And most of the most of the expenses that you'll see at a school district are really in the 100 fund and the 200 fund, the 100 being the general fund and the 200 be special revenues. And that's for dedicated to like federal resources, for example, or state grant aid that are targeted investments. And so that's really what we're kind of showing there in that on the left-hand side is the fund types. And we also include the share.
Mike, before you leave the fund types, we had a question. Is there a way with the tool to only show amounts coming from the state school fund?
The answer to that is no. And here's the challenge with that, with the state school fund from the state, is that we distribute the dollars to school districts, and then the school districts distribute that to schools. That transparency, we lose that transparency. We can probably, I mean, we could infer, we can imply that, but it's but we won't be able to say exactly how much. Again, is the state piece and how much is the local. And as you probably remember from my last presentation with the state school fund, I showed where the local contribution and the state contribution varies considerably around the state. And that's that yin and yang slide that I showed. So to answer the question, no, we can't say, we can't track it to the state school fund exactly. We just have the seven funds, and the state school fund is rolled into the general fund for a school district. And so that's how we're able to break this information out. I will also add that this tool, we're literally taking millions and millions of data points with financial data and student data and all the various data, and we're compressing that. And that information is available on when you get into the actual Excel workbook, it'll be under the data section. And so, again, I think that's also very interesting information. If you want
can I ask a follow-up? I'm so sorry. This is Toya. Sure. So I see for this school, it says at the bottom, there's $20,205 per pupil. That includes state school fund, local option levy, and all the other, maybe Title I, I don't know, all the other pieces that go into that particular school divided by the number of students, but we can't back out just the state school fund piece of it. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
Okay.
And again, because the state school fund is distributed to school districts, and then we don't know what portion of that general fund is just the state school fund for this particular instance. So in the data that we collect from school districts right now. All right, so moving a little bit to we show the share between the district expenditures and the school expenditures, because again, you'll see where some districts are doing a much better job of reporting that at the school level than at the district level. Moving over to the middle section there with the pie charts, what we're trying to show there is how much money is spent, and then we try to break it out into categories that are similar to what we saw under Chalkboard, for example, where classroom support, building support, central support. And I apologize for the clarity on this slide, but that's the best I could do with transferring it from Excel to a Google slide. But again, you'll be able to see that a little clearer once you get into the workbook itself. And then, of course, the direct classroom expenditures. And again, you can see as you scroll through the schools, you can see how that changes from school to school, from district to district. And then on the far right-hand side, we also are showing how this school compares to the rest of the state for the grade band, and then how it compares to other schools within the school district. And that's what the bar charts are showing you is as for comparison's sake on a statewide and a district basis. Something that we're kind of proud of at the top is what I call equity resources. And in my work and consultation with, we brought in and worked with a national organization that, we did comparisons. And as I mentioned before, where in a previous presentation where I talked about if you look at the needs of the school and the expenditures of the school, sometimes those lined up and sometimes those didn't line up. And what we were looking at is the two factors I think are important information from a needs basis is English language learners, special education, and of course, poverty. We, in this particular slide iteration of the workbook as is right now, we used bands because of the sometimes we have data that we need to protect. And so that's the reason we use the banding in this. But as you move through the schools, you'll see where those bands will adjust and will show where there's greater needs and where there's not as much need. But again, it's identifying, we're trying to show where in some instances schools have higher needs. And so, the amount per school, we would hope that we would see a relationship there. Sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. Sometimes you'll see when you look through these reports that there's relatively uniform dispersion of resources, even though in some schools there's a higher need than in other schools. So again, that's the, kind of just a tour of the report itself. And I encourage you to go out and take a look at the website and any feedback. Admittedly so with other events with COVID and what have you and responding to the pandemic, this work, we haven't been able to focus on this as much as possible as we'd like to, but we're looking to get back to this work in the not too distant future. Scott, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, my question is, it shows the ESL special education and poverty for the district level, but does that not change when you click on an individual school?
So good question. So getting back to, again, from my state school fund presentation, I don't know if you remember where I talked about some of the weights in the state school fund are at the student level and some weights are at the district level. And so, for example, general education, English language learners, pregnant and parenting, those are student level. And so we can track the weights to the student. Poverty is a district weight where the data that we use is at the district level. And so we can't disaggregate that by student per se. We use the small area poverty estimate where it's a federal report that we use for that. And then we also used, and so again, breaking that down to student level, we don't have student level poverty data. That's, again, that's one, it's difficult data to collect. Some will say, well, free and reduced lunch data. That's a possibility to look at that. That's free and reduced. However, I would caution the quality of that data. It varies considerably across the state. So I would be cautious of that. But what we do with this particular report here is we take the poverty data and we infer that for the schools within that school district. And if you think of like a temperature, like if you watch the temperature, like the weather forecast, there's high and low levels, depending on the temperature within that. Similarly with the poverty, you can see where there's higher levels of poverty and lower levels of poverty. I won't name the school districts. I think we all know which those are that have higher and lower levels of poverty. But again, we were trying to get at and demonstrate where there's higher needs of poverty, where there would likely be higher needs to try to assist with the impacts of poverty. And then to move on to the next slide, I'm almost finished here, but just kind of want to show, again, kind of the diversity and variety that we have in expenditures across the state. So what this is it's showing all 250 schools and their per pupil expenditures for the 2019-20 school year. And you see on the far left-hand side, we have the ranges from $10,000 on up to $90,000. And you can see where the amount is a little bit, it's right around probably the $1,000 mark. In fact, there's even one there that's $300, and that's essentially what's happening the scenario that I described earlier is where the school essentially was allocating all those resources at the district level and very little at the school level. And so the amount, when you calculate that out, the per pupil at that school was a very low amount. But you can see how that increases. And then we kind of have an average for the majority of the schools across state. But then when you get over to about the 80 percentile to the right, it really starts to peak up. And you can see one school is almost at $80,000. Again, that's a very small high school that has very few students in it. But again, those costs, because the numerator is so small, the amount per student is much higher. But most of those where it starts really increasing are schools that receive the small school correction. And again, because of the the size of the school and the amount of resources in order to provide resources. And again, we see a similar phenomenon if we go to the next slide with elementary schools. Again, we start very low, and on the left-hand side, you see the dollar amounts. This is roughly 720 elementary schools, again, using the 1920 per pupil spending data. You have the dollar amounts going up to $80,000. You can see where we start out at a very low amount per pupil, and then we increase going up to right about $70,000 per pupil. And again, a big portion of those schools where it really starts to increase are small elementary schools that receive the small school correction. But you can see that it continues to increase. Of the 720, it's definitely not a flat line, if you will, across state. So what have we learned? Let's go on to the next slide. In this work in the last, going on 4 years, that school districts continue to improve their reporting expenses at the school level. And like I said, when we first started looking at this data in 15-16, there was the data wasn't very good, I will tell you, at the school level. It wasn't consistency, again, because of the accountability. And again, moving this, bringing this, changing this culture, getting school districts and staff to think about this moving forward. And I will tell you that many of the business managers around the state have done an amazing job of moving towards this and realizing and making sure that this report, that we have good information coming out of this and pushing more information to the school level. Again, just identifying the change in culture. It appears that school districts are changing strategies for allocating resources. And again, as I said, earlier examples versus looking at the data of late, they're doing a much better job of aligning the expenses with the needs. Are we perfect? Absolutely not. Do we need some work there? Yes. I think we still need to, as I identified there, we need to create more awareness around the resource equity. And I think that many people are willing to listen to that. We would, as identified earlier, we'd like to improve upon the current model, the current report, and again, just to perhaps use a different type of a tool to do this work. And I also want to note that there's work that we've been doing with our federal partners with the National Center of Education Statistics, what's called the School Level Financial Survey. And some states have joined, it's not a mandate, but there's been roughly about 30 states that are moving towards this, including Oregon. We've been wanting to move towards having a consistent model across the country that we could do comparisons. And I'll pause there as I see Amanda has a question.
Yes, thanks, Mike, for the presentation. Again, I think that just going back to this piece around how we then intersect this data with BIPOC student populations, and I'm aware of the challenges with that cross-section of data, but it would be helpful in the next conversation to dive in a little deeper. It sounds to me like it's really helpful to get the high-level district per pupil spending numbers at a high level, but then it sounds like there's very wide variation between different schools within those districts, and I hear the challenges around getting that information. So maybe it's something to give to the researcher to think about. But in as much as we can intersect the data that we're seeing on those diverse communities and how that intersects with per pupil spending, that would be really helpful.
So again, just getting on that last point here, I'll wrap up, is that there's going to be a federal mandate that we put together, what's called the School Level Financial Survey, and it will be part of our financial federal reporting. The great news about that is that we will have more consistency in our information. The other great part about this is that we will be able to compare our data across state lines. And again, looking at needs. And so we're definitely moving in a great, in my opinion, a great direction as far as being able to have useful information for comparison. And I'll pause there. I see Toya has a question.
So I just wanted to pick up where Amanda's question left off, just wanting to understand if it's possible to overlay student demographics with even just the two charts you just showed about high school expenditure and elementary school expenditure. Is that possible? Okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes,
Thank
we're
you.
able to. Yeah, in this presentation, admittedly, so I didn't do that. But I just wanted to show you what this is as it currently stands. Clearly, we can expand upon that from research perspective and include the demographic information for each of these schools.
Thank you.
And I'll pause if there's any other questions. comments?
Last question, just to clarify, that won't be possible by just using state school fund dollars.
That is correct. We would have to infer that. We don't have a data element that where school districts report expenditures using only state school fund dollars. An example that I often give is that there's a number of resources that districts have that roll into their general fund. And so there's, a multitude of colors, which eventually all rolls up to one color of the general fund. And so the revenues, we can see that at a school district level, but we can't see how that is transferred to the local schools and how it's spent at the local schools. From accounting practice, they just don't spend resources in that manner where they have 20 different checking accounts, if you will.
I'd like to put a finer point too on a comment I made earlier, because I think it may have gotten lost in the chat, is just a comparison between reporting for the state school fund and the presentation you just provided and the information we're gathering from the student investment account. And I think this maybe would be appropriate in the theme around learning from other models. So I can imagine there's going to be a conversation in the future where we talk more specifically about the student investment account. So just want to make that request in advance. If we can get sort of a comparison around what information we're learning through each of those would be really helpful.
Sure. So, and to that, Amanda, thank you for the comment. There's reports that SIA collects that, that they gather that information. Currently, we don't have that same report requirement for the state school fund.
I don't think I see any other hands up, Mike, or any other questions. A few asks in the chat, but okay. Do you have any final comments, Mike, or you ready to transition into contracts?
I think I'm just kind of looking through some of the comments now. I believe I've answered most of those questions. Yeah, I'm ready. I believe I'm ready to move on.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. Always interesting. And it's pretty fascinating the amount of data we have at the local level, just starting from 2017, right? So pretty fresh stuff here. Okay, so Tamara, can you take us to our next slide? Okay. So I know I told you, I promised you you'd see this language a lot today. So we're going to transition into talking about the plan for this contract researcher, right? And I highlighted these three sort of clauses within the budget note because these are the three that seem to be dictating or directing the most what the researcher is going to help us with. So there's the study of the impacts of state school funding. There's directing us, ODE, to award the contract, and then there's some minimum qualifications in there. And then also, though, there's the, the review of the variations at the school level. That's why we had like Mike with all that data in front of you today. And it's talking about doing that across 25 different school districts. So the next slide, Tamara, we can kind of buzz over, but okay. So this was the problem statement, right? I put in front of you earlier. So as we were kind of working through it, I think, remember I said, okay, this helped to inform. And so let's try to keep some of this in mind and also, those clauses in the budget note as we start to think about what are we going to ask this researcher to do. So next slide. Okay. So sat down and started to draft critical questions specifically relating to students. And then the next slide is relating to teachers. So focusing on students first. So the first one seemed to be, what is the impact of state laws and local policies and procedures on state and local resource distribution to schools? What data or evidence is available or can be collected to demonstrate the racial inequities, adverse effects, contributing causes, trends, and current needs? I think you heard from Mike, there's some holes in the data. I think you heard that from John as well, right? So that's one of the questions I think we have. The third bullet there, what are the adverse impacts that BIPOC and tribal students experience under current conditions, policies, procedures, and expenditures? The fourth, what are the causes or contributing factors that produce or perpetuate these inequities? Remember, some of the small groups started to raise, things that might be contributing factors to this. So these could be such things as, policies and practices that are not equitable, funding formulas that are inequitable. Also, like there's also other causes or contributing factors, things such as, I think Mike started to identify some of those things, the size of the school, the number of kids. And so, so this question seemed to be at the heart of this. And then the final bullet point, what influences local expenditures? How do districts allocate resources? What patterns exist? So remember, the charge of the budget note was looking across 25 different school districts. So what is influencing that? So some examples, does the creation and implementation of an equity lens versus a racial equity lens specifically, or other initiatives influence those local level impacts? To support students that are at the heart of the budget note. So these were the draft questions, and I put the word draft for a reason there. That critical questions that we'd want the researcher to be looking at, right? So I'm going to pause. So in regards to students, when we look at these high level questions, what's missing? What's your reaction to these? Did we get it? I could pose that in a couple of ways, but Amanda.
I have a reaction, but I'll pause because I've spoken a lot and want to give space for other folks before.
Okay. I should say too, the way that we've envisioned the RFP and the direction to the researcher is that we would issue the contract, but the researcher would also come back to the group and talk to the group as part of their initial entry into the project. So this is not the last time we're going to be posing some questions to the researcher, just saying that. But
great, I'll jump in then. So I think the first question is actually too broad. I think it needs to be honed in on a little bit. So I'll just say that as a reaction. I actually think just based on the conversation today, it would be really valuable. And I think it's a combination maybe of the second bullet point and the last one to really focus in on identifying what the spending patterns are. So I see what patterns exist, but I think just really honing in on the spending patterns and getting that information, because it sounds like that information exists at different points. And just having somebody really focus on mapping what those spending patterns are and being able to overlay it with the data that we're talking about. I know we keep asking for that at different points, but it seems to me like that's a lot of the work. And from a transparency perspective, I feel like would give us what we need to begin to dive into some of the other questions, because I feel like some of the other ones are more, there's a lot of community engagement required in some of those that may not be envisioned through this process. So I think just really wrapping our arms around the data in a way that is useful for the next step would be really helpful. So that's my first piece. And the second one is in what data or evidence is available or can be collected. I think adding what barriers exist to gathering the data would be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I see a comment in the chat. What are the non-school factors that impact community capacity to generate revenue? Lori, did you want to expand upon that at all, or?
Oh, I just know that there are so many aspects of, wealth inequality and all sorts of, whether or not any area of the state is economically vital. There are a number of factors that impact the ability of communities to contribute to the overall formula per student as it relates to funding and local revenue piece is what I was thinking of. But the same question could be asked at the state level. What are the non-school related impacts? Schools are a product of the communities in which they are found. And what are those other factors that influence the environment in a way that results in potential inequities as they're discovered? I think that the whole picture is important to paint.
Scott?
So, this has been kind of an ongoing thing in my mind. The state school fund is a resource. How much money of the school money is going to a district without much input into how they spend that money. So if somebody gets poverty dollars, doesn't mean they're spending it on programs that help poverty students, right? Necessarily, there's no hook to that, right? There are certain laws, the Title I and the minimum effort in ESL or in special education, stuff like that, are somewhat tied in there. And I think that's kind of what one is kind of moving to two, but I guess I'm struggling with how this researcher is going to trace the money that the fund gives relative to the spending patterns of the district and to come up with an information of how might we distribute the resources better to help students in more need. And I don't know how to make that a question for them, but it seems like we have one thing and we have another thing, but we don't have a thing joining them together. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Thanks, Scott. George. Oh, George, I think you're muted.
Sorry. I think for me, Lori said some things that I felt were important. There are so many things that make a community spend the way it spends. I think we even had the winners and losers kind of conversation that we shared of how our funding formula does things. And the more you're in certain areas, let's say rural areas that are mid-size, their poverty levels fluctuate. They're more homogeneous student groupings. Their distance for travel is totally different. If you're getting paid at the bottom 30%, you can't afford to give funds to teachers in different ways or to programs or services or different ways. You don't have enough special program funds to do special program things. There's all of these things, even in special education. If you have 18% of your students in special education, yet you only get 11% cap, it forces you to spend even more money that you have into special education so they can have, so students can have services. So there's so many things that kind of make the ball unravel because of where you live and how you live. What you have in terms of economy of scale for a metro area or a suburban area or a rural area just determines how you spend funds and how you do things. So my point is there's a lot of things to think about. And I kind of want you to just think of like what's working well too, or I want us to think about what's working well, what's not working well, how we do use targeted funds already from Student Success Act, how we do use funds from ELL that's already in the factor, how we do use funds for migrant education and services that we get, how we do use funds for special education. There's just a lot there that I think also needs to be included as you unravel this. But I also just want to really make it clear that rural areas spend money in rural ways, and metro areas spend money in metro ways, and suburban areas. And I think that's the kind of conversations that's been shared with all the data, but it's very important that these are all parts of the equation for how funds get spent. Oh, that's it.
Thanks, George. I see in the chat, Carlos said that there's more oversight and accountability with federal grant dollars than state school funds that districts get. And that there was a comment about the better portion of that question would require deeper engagement with impacted communities. And Amanda, I think that was probably in reference to what are the third bullet, what are the adverse impacts? That comment was made, I think. And then Mike, I see you have a fan, you have a question, Mike Wilfong. Does the school level per pupil spending include transportation costs? Oh, and I see you've answered it already. There we go. Yes, the report includes transportation expenses. So thank you. So yeah, George, you still have your hands up. Do you have another comment?
I'm good.
Okay, Paul, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what George was saying. It's also the state school fund for each district. It also covers our staff and any contractual agreements and personnel. And then, you know, our budget committees approve it. And so each district should be posted on their website and really transparent about how they're spending those dollars. And pretty much in districts like the ones I've been working in, you pretty much know where your state school fund is going the previous year, and it's already allocated, because if you change it, then you'll be either reducing positions or days or programs, something like that. So our budget committee does a good job of using the equity lens as we plan for our how we're going to spend our state school fund, and we do it through what our strategic planning goals are tied to the equity lens, as well as how is it going to benefit students. So all of those things are taken into account. And then it's we try to be as transparent as possible. And we've had more participation on our budget committee meetings since we've gone virtual, because we have a group of people that participate in those committees, a lot of parents and community members, but now that it's virtual, we also get guests, which we usually didn't get. So I just wanted to add that in.
Thanks, Paul. One of the silver linings to virtual meetings, right? We should have mentioned at the beginning, we are broadcasting this publicly again off of YouTube. So you have an audience. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide. So Tamara. Okay. So the next slide, I'm focusing on teachers, mainly because of the clause that I put there from the budget note that talks about that the committees to review variations in school level funding across multiple types expenditures across 25 school districts, but it's very specifically calls out to review the proportion of diverse teachers. So this is the first time like teachers are mentioned, right, in the budget note. So some of the draft critical questions related to teachers is, what is the impact of school level spending on the number of teachers who are BIPOC or tribal members? We now know from the presentations today, it's going up, but I think someone in the chat said if it keeps at this rate, I think someone said 30 years before it catches up. So what are the causes or contributing factors that produce or perpetuate these inequities between schools regarding the number of teachers who are BIPOC or tribal members? And then what data or evidence is available or can be collected to demonstrate the racial inequities, adverse impacts, and contributing causes, trends, and current needs. So this, like I said, was starting to get at the teacher questions that were kind of embedded in the budget note. So reactions. I know I had one question when I saw this clause anyway. It was, why 25 school districts? Why not 10? Why not 50? Don't know.
In regards to that, in the conversation that led to the creation of this note, Did they think that 25 was representational? Because it says 25 school districts, but it doesn't say what kind. It doesn't say urban, suburban, rural, whatever.
Correct.
And so is it left up to this advisory committee or to the researcher to pick those 25? Is there a statement about representation?
Yeah, there is no other statement. Excuse me, there is no statement in the budget note about why 25. Clearly, a researcher that would pick these 25 is going to do so that they're representational of our state, and there would be diversity amongst the school districts, but there's no further direction. Excuse me.
Cindy, my question still remains on this about it, because this is specific, this sentence is specific to the committee review. Is that different from, can we clarify for the group if that's different from what the researchers review?
Yeah, thanks, Iris, for that question. I had that very same question when I first read this. I was like, wait a minute, we're talking about the researcher up here, now we're talking about the committee. As I started to think about this, for this committee to be able to do this sentence, I think you're going to need information from the researcher. So that's why I included it in this as part of our conversation with the researcher. But you're right, it distinguishes at this point between committee versus the researcher, actually. Scott, you had a question?
So since the current funding formula includes the teacher, teachers who have worked longer, the senior teacher clause, whatever we want to call it, since that's directly in there and we're already considering adjustments relative to teachers, could we ask something about would adjusting, is there an additional cost to hire appropriate teachers, diverse teachers? So some data about what would it take to keep, to attract and keep diverse teaching populations in the profession and in Oregon. Is there a way to quantify that, or I don't know?
This is Marguerite. Some of the answers to your questions aren't about money. They are community needs and creating relationships. And if school districts can and do support affinity groups, if they do support mentoring, if they do support collaborations in a way that that help the social, emotional, mental health of an educator rather than just monetarily. Is part of that going to cost? It does, but not on the surface.
But it still would be a cost to the district, right? So the time for the teachers to be in their affinity groups and the, it just seems like there could be a way to somehow come up with something. I'm just looking at, what do they have, a 0.25 adjustment for teacher educator.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Marguerite. I saw a question from Lori in the chat that says, given the current staffing crisis, how does the study consider the anomaly that may exist caused by the pandemic? The issue with that, though, is that, I hate to break it to all of you, we're not done with the pandemic. So we don't know all of the impacts of the pandemic yet. We also, as you were looking at some of those slides, our data has a lag time, right? So in some cases, we don't have data even from last year yet coming in, right? And certainly not this year. So that would be one of the problems with trying to ascertain what the impacts of the pandemic have been, is it's not done and we just don't have the data yet. It's so fresh. And then I see Amanda, so similar addition, I would request that an analysis of barriers be added to the final question. So barriers, barriers to collecting data and evidence, what barriers exist in relation to teachers. And then Mike has answered some questions. And then I see a call out to the EAC. And I've heard that a couple of times today, so we can certainly work with our EAC partners and have that information coming in. So Iris, see your hand up.
Oops, sorry, I forgot to take it down.
That's okay. And George, I see your hand up.
I think I was just trying to encapsulate at least maybe what I heard between Marguerite and Scott, kind of getting into it, maybe a question about what types of supports or what types of systems or what types of best practices are there to support BIPOC teachers or tribal men.
Yeah,
if that's what they were getting at. Maybe they were.
Okay, and Paul, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the impact to the pandemic. And I would say that it's always been a barrier, a teacher shortage and a diversity shortage. And we're always recruiting from the same small pool of educators of color across the state. And we see that it's slow and it's incremental in how the diversity is growing, even though most districts' efforts, especially depending on the diversity in the district, they're working to make sure that their staff is representative of their student population. And I would say that with the pandemic, it's a lot harder. And it's also really much harder to retain. So for me, we've increased our diversity quite a bit when I was in Centennial and also at MESD as well. And we get staff that are great. We have connection and we don't know what's going on with them personally. And if they have family that live out of the state, some of them are impacted by the pandemic. People are losing relatives, people are losing their jobs. Sorry, I got kids in the background. And so it's, they end up doing what's best for their family and we lose a lot of those great people that we recruited. So it's more difficult during the pandemic. And I think that's something that every district needs to really work at and also assess and kind of make adjustments for. And also educators across the state need a lot of grace right now. They need support. They also, it doesn't need to just be the same exact accountability that we've always had because people are going through personal trauma and trauma based on the pandemic and based on race and based on lots of different things. And so to really support educators, we really have to give them the will and the skill and the capacity to do their jobs effectively during this pandemic. And they also need to know that we care about them and we support them. And I think those are like some of the real important things about retaining educators during this time.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Yeah, patience towards our educators. Yeah. Echo that. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move us to the next slide, Tamara. Okay. So these minimum qualifications I pulled out from the budget note, and and the budget note was really specific about them. And so anyway, I'm just laying them out here. Are there other, and there may be other qualifications that we add here that we would typically for a research contract, right? But I just wanted to call these out that in the budget note, it's definitely talking about someone with experience, right? And significant experience doing this work. So next slide. Then as we're, starting to draft this contract, and starting to draft our, the RFP rather, what is this researcher going to be delivering? And, they're completing a study. So that's pretty clear. the study has to include spending at the state and local level. Obviously, those questions and things we just talked about are starting to refine. What does that look like, right? The study must include the variations with the 25 school districts, right? I put at least 25 school districts in here. The budget note calls out 25. My thoughts are right now to leave that to the researcher, a review of other research relating to spending patterns and disparities, because there may be other research that's been done in this area out there of other states that may be interesting to us. So we put that in as well. Next slide. So one of the things, though, that comes up very quickly when we start talking about the research contract is risks and challenges, right? And I laid out some of these in the last week in our meeting, but they bear repeating because they're definitely going to impact what we asked this researcher to do. So the first one on here is the procurement timeline and backlog. Last meeting, remember I said that if this contract is over 150,000, we know it takes 6 to 9 months to issue, right? So you'll see us trying to mitigate that in the next slide. And then data requests, limited data at the school level, you start to hear, John and Mike talk about some of that, consistencies, other limitations, and so forth. So next slide. Okay. Here we go. So as I've been talking to our procurement director about this, is what can we do to mitigate this timeline issue? Is one of the ideas that we came up with was to do a phased approach for the researcher and to lay it out and say, okay, phase 1 is we're going to pay you up to 150,000. So picked 150,000, so it's literally 149,000, right? Because with that limitation, it doesn't have to go through DOJ and DAS. So it cuts several months off of the process, right? And then to ask these researchers, so here's the project, what parts of the project would you be able to do in phase 1 for basically 150,000 given the timeline that we're going to give you, right? And what would be your project plan? We're going to also be asking them, so then if you can only do so much in phase 1, what would be your plan if there was a phase 2 and a phase 3, right? So some of the advantages I already mentioned, this creates a faster process, and it gets information to this committee faster, right? Which I think is super important for us to deliver a product, right? There are some disadvantages, though, is that we anticipate that these researchers will come back and say, we can't address all these research questions for that much money or in that timeline, right? So I wanted to get some reactions to this because, it's the timeline with the procurement and the research is definitely something that we're really having to solve for with this. And I think it's something that whether it be the legislature or others don't realize how long it takes under state procurement laws to actually issue a contract, right? So what this also could mean, I'm waiting for the question, well, will it be a phase 2 and a phase 3? Possibly. That's something else I'm talking to with my procurement director, and he's actually consulting DAS with how much we can forecast that and not trigger it going to DAS, okay? But recognizing that those phases may come during a time when we've issued the report back to the legislature with the note that, hey, there's more information coming on this. That could be a possibility. Also, very curious to see what these researchers will come back and say, wait, yes, this is what we can do in phase 1 for this much. Would also dictate if there's a phase 2 and a phase 3. Does this lead to having multiple researchers? Not sure, Marguerite. And here's why I would say that. So one of the questions we have into DAS is if we signal, if we issue and we say, okay, this is going to be phase 1, and there's a possibility we may amend the contract and add on a phase 2 and 3 and give you more money, that would be one researcher, right? Not sure if we can do that and adhere to under $150,000. Another possibility would be, okay, here's the chunk we're taking, phase 1, and now we're issuing for phases 2 and 3, and this is what we're doing. And those would be different researchers. The other possibility too is that as we're looking at this, we anticipate the successful bidder will have multiple people working on the project, just because of the scope of the work. So, can you concurrent phase 1 and 2 contracts, like break them up? Well, DAS frowns upon us breaking up contracts to avoid laws, so no. There's various issues around that. Also, probably some of the initial work is needed for the later work. So, but I like thinking like this. This is good. This is really good. Keep those questions coming.
Can you
is it possible to break? Oh,
can you split the question around about students and split the question around educators into 2 separate contracts?
I don't know. Maybe, possibly. Yeah, those are all great ideas. Yeah. We've also explored, I didn't put it up here because honestly, it was a bit of a dead end, is doing some sort of interagency agreement, but which would be faster, basically, like with a university or something. Universities honestly take a significant administrative percentage off of contracts, and we couldn't identify someone who would be actually, well, we weren't sure there's someone interested. So we've had a few dead ends too, trying to solve for this. So Jim.
I'm just wondering, Cindy, if you find out, let's say you put it out there for 149, you find out from prospective bidders that they can't get it done. You go back to the legislature in February and say, can we adjust this timeline to get this back to you? Because I don't want to rush the work. I want to make sure we get the work done right. And can you then reapproach either the e-board or the legislature with, understand these timelines, but given our constraints with DAS and DOJ, we need to look at different timelines with regard to the report back to the legislature, because that's, you're engineering it back from that date.
I am. No, thank you, Jim, for that. Yeah, and and there's been other big projects that we had reports back to the legislature where we basically presented, here's the first part of this project you gave us, and we're coming back here with the second part of this project, right? So that's definitely, a possibility that's sitting there. And so yeah, all those are possibilities. But also, I think, remember too, last week I said regarding this, I'm going to try to be super transparent with you all about this and some of these challenges, right? Because this is pretty significant. And the other thing, in case anyone's wondering here, so what if you made it a top priority in your agency? Would it go through faster? We have 81 top priorities in our agency right now. 81 sounds like a lot of federal dollars pumping through us right now, and a lot of dollars going out to districts. So there's that issue kind of going on too. But I appreciate, though, the creative thinking, and we will be thinking about many of these suggestions as we try to start to work this through. So the other questions that came up regarding these is like, what's the committee's role and so forth? So it's the agency that's issuing the contract, right? And there's a specific procurement process that we're going to be following with that. When that contract is issued, you'll see the formal issuance in this committee, and we encourage you to pass it on to whoever you'd like. We also have a process where procurement can reach out to, a list of prospective, researchers. And so I collected that information from last meeting and so forth to provide that, so they'll know that it's out there, right? So as I said before, as we're envisioning this, is one of the roles for the researchers to come back to this committee and say, okay, so here's my plan, and now let's get some input into this plan. So you'll be interacting with that researcher before they dive deeply into the work. Tamara, next slide. Okay, these are the, so the next steps with this is that, so reviewing obviously all of this input today, obviously we're talking to DAS, we're talking to our procurement experts. We're also issuing that RFP and selecting the research contractor. Also identifying future meeting dates through a doodle poll. There is information that you've asked in here that I think previously in my timeline, I had you not coming back till like April. That's going to be earlier so that we can provide you with some of those information, those questions that you've raised, right? But knowing also that we have some sort of dead zone dates coming up, holidays, the legislature, things like that. So trying to work around that. So those are some of the things that'll be coming up. And then we also are continuing to populate that State School Fund Advisory Committee webpage with information, including like the recording from last meeting and just, you know, the PowerPoints and things like that. Yeah, and are we going to email these slides out? Absolutely, Jim. And we're going to post them on our webpage. Yeah. So let's see. Tamara, I think I just did your slide. And I think it's our last slide.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. You
I'm sorry,
did.
I think I ran over the top of you. I'm sorry.
It's fine. No, it's great. Thank you all for, you know, a long meeting, but really great information, great input for us. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And have a good rest of your evening, everybody. Try to stay dry.